Okay, so we'll go to the board in a bit, but I want to start with share screen on a couple of things and what we started with last night with a couple of thoughts. And give me just 1 second to find the right. I have a lot of files to different things to share. So, um, and I think I did the wrong one first. Sorry. Give me just wrong one. Here we go. Mm. Okay. This is going to be basically, I've been working on this since 2000. It's a study on the east wind. And I don't remember what put me in this direction, but I think it might have been the studies, because they're connected to this, that Elder Parmenter did in Brazil, 2019, and then May 2019, and then sort of a summary or review of it in Germany of 2021. And I will reference several presentations. I do have them written down in various places for those that want to go back and study those presentations. I'm also going to reference several things that Elder Tess had said. So first, we'll start with a couple of things from Elder Tess. And this is from her study on tracing the history of Concord. And I think it was in 2020, after May 25th. I don't remember the date, so maybe if somebody had that, they can post it in the chat. And so, actually, first is this quote by Ellen White. In reviewing our past history, having traveled over every step of advance to our present standing, I can say, praise God. As I see what God has wrought, I am filled with astonishment and with confidence in Christ as leader. We have nothing to fear for the future except as we shall forget the way the Lord has led us and their teaching in our past history. And as I listened to Anna's presentation and review on how we study, and to me, it kind of complements what I'm going to say here is if Ellen White was a prophet for her dispensation, we have messengers, we won't call them messengers, prophets, we have that in our dispensation too, which have led us to this present position. So I found that for my own self, the reviews of past studies really help put in place principles. I don't know if you would say principles, but definitely some foundations to our history. And so, from tracing the history of Concord, these are a couple of comments that she made. The importance of every single opportunity, repeating prophecy, studying reform lines. This is not a dry subject that turns us away from an understanding of the character of God. It is only the way we can understand the character of it is the only way we can understand the character of God. And if we don't approach all of our study through reform lines and methodology, 100% of the time, we find ourselves as the Protestants praying to a different God. And this next one, I can't remember if it was, I think it was the same study. If not, it was cause and effect. They were both together. Cause and effect was first, and then tracing the history of Concord. We have to look at our own history with the solemn thought of what God is expecting of us by now, just as priests, but as not just as priests, but as 144,000. That is not a low calling, but it comes with quite a severe test because these are meant to be teachers, the 144,000. And if they won't follow reform lines and methodology, they won't be safe and they'll find themselves passed by, which I thought was a pretty frightening reminder of understanding. And so I have questions then. These are thoughts that I have based on what I've been reviewing and based on the fact that well, I mean, I could be wrong, but my observation in watching, keeping up with all the camp meetings in the last few years, it seems like we all struggle. And I know I hear it from others personally, and I can admit it myself. We struggle with being able to be skillful in using the methodology. And I question in my own self, are we meant to really fully be able to use it ourselves, or does that come from the messengers? As just things I think about as I look at my own inability. And it seems like none but the messengers really do that well and correct. I'm not denying that there are people out there. I just know for my own self and things, the feedback that I get seems we definitely struggle with being able to use the methodology. So having said that, would we not at least rely on the principles or the foundations, the teachings that have been put in place by the messengers that we have in our dispensation? So I don't know if anybody, I can open it up for comment there. I'm open for comments anytime if you have thoughts on these questions here. I'll give you a minute if you'd like to, if anybody would like to say anything.
Just one thing came to mind, that teaching doesn't always look like what you're doing right now, of being in front of the camera and the board, or with presentations. It can just be like striking up a conversation with a person. Just our presence, our being an example to other people. We teach in a wide variety of ways, not just through events like this. Thanks.
Yes, thank you for that. Thank you. Anybody else? Try to keep the chat open too, sorry. Okay, so I'll go ahead and move forward then.
I'm so sorry. What is the question?
Sure, go
I
ahead.
missed it. I missed the question.
What is the question? If we struggle to use, if we struggle to be skillful and use the methodology well ourselves in coming to conclusions, et cetera, in our own studies, and it seems that's a challenge within the movement, that the messengers themselves, as in I'm going to be specific, Elder Tess and Elder Parminder, they know how to do this and do it well and do it correct. So would we not at least rely on the things that they put in place in getting us to where we are today? That's my question.
I have a comment on that. So the exercise that we did of having 5 speakers about the Sunday Law Waymark, I think that was an exercise for us to, look at the methodology of each teacher and see if it's correct or not. And he puts as one of the first secret of success being methodology. So it's very critical that we do understand methodology. Yeah.
I agree.
Going forward, yeah, it's what has shaken this movement, the past, and yeah, I don't know what the future holds, but yeah.
Thank you. I agree. So having said all that, we'll go into some thoughts, and I'm going to change screens a lot and go to the board as well, so we'll bounce around. But speaking from the presentation cause and effect, and here's the date just to make it better. The tracing the history of Concord was the 28th of October 2020, and this is cause and effect. It was the day before. It's around the 29-minute mark or so. She says we spend too much time focusing on Al-Qaeda and ISIS. We should not fail to focus on the Islamic countries of the Middle East, because in prophecy and history, we can tend to be looking at countries. So she's putting the emphasis there that prophecy in history, you're going to be directed to countries, not so much Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And so we know that after 9/11, the US invaded Afghanistan with the purpose to take down the Taliban, which at the time was now the ruling government of Afghanistan. And we'll look at that on the board later as that developed. So then in tracing the history of Concord, again, at about the 26-minute mark, I suggest that like 1840, we should look to states, to countries, and that was with Afghanistan overthrowing the ruling Taliban. So she's again putting this focus on looking at countries rather than and who was ruling that country at the time. So where I kind of began this, what I mentioned before, was with the studies by Elder Parmenter that he put in place on the subject of Uriah Smith being right. If anybody's familiar with those, there are several presentations and they're marked here where to go to. In the Tahiti one in particular, number 4, the whole series, I think there's 10 studies there, will touch on this topic, but I did place the Tahiti one in the forum because I think that's where he mostly says what this, hopefully, this study actually lays out.
Question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, question. Taking you a little bit back on the issue of the not Islam not being confined by a radical Islam like Al Qaeda, Taliban. So because I've had it being taught that in application that you're not looking for a power that is confined into a country, like, specifically talking about Elena studies. So radical Islam being that in its spiritual application, looking for a power that is confined into a geographical location or even a country. So is that in contradiction?
I'm struggling to follow totally if you can kind of summarize that. And I like to use the word if you could, because these will east wind if we could, rather than defining if you could.
So you just mentioned there, I think it's the slide above that. One slide above that, what you have.
Up here?
Yeah, yes, right there. So I think it's a quote from Elder Tess there,
Yes,
saying we spent too much time focusing on Al Qaeda and ISIS, and the focus, I guess, should be on countries, not the ideology, I guess. So that seems to contradict some of the studies that we've been getting.
Okay. Those are some of my thoughts on there as well. The country is what actually allows it to grow, and we'll see that as we progress through here. The country and its government is what is actually allowed when you talk about the angry horse to rise and have power. Does that help? And we'll see it as we go through.
Yeah, it does help. I'm just trying to keep in mind what other people have said about that, but it really does help to make us understand that power, that whatever the ideology cannot operate without a system or a country or state power.
Yeah, and that is why I kind of that's kind of why I focused on this here. Would you not at least rely on those principles or the foundational teachings that we have received in the past in our current dispensation by our messengers? So for me, I find myself measuring what others say based on some of those things that are already put in place. Does that help?
For me, it does. Yes, for now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So if I'm not good at the methodology, again, why I made that statement, if I'm not good at the methodology, I could at least rely on the things that are already put in place by the messengers that we've been given. And then when I listen to the different studies, it helps me to measure the things that are being taught and said. Okay, so we know the U.S. invaded Afghanistan. Let's see where we left off here. Okay, we're going to go to a couple other quotes. And all of these are good studies to go back if you want to watch them all the way through. This is 2019, May to June, Portugal Elder Test. There's 14, 15, and 16 that are really helpful. This was one study that I was trying to find a proof to bring back to my own self something I knew was taught and trying to remember, was that what was taught? And just to make sure that I'm not misspeaking on anything. Okay, so we'll see the board work on that in just a minute as well. So, and I'll make that point. So this is Elder Tess. We saw that 1979 to 1989, you can mark a history of 10 years which God's people were meant to recognize. So I would ask the question, from 1979 to 1989, who were God's people? Open for in the chat or
wasn't it the Seventh-day Adventist Church?
right, because this movement wasn't raised up yet. So yes, it was. So what she's stating in here is that in that history, it was a 10-year history that you can mark, and this was the Soviet-Afghan War, which God's people were meant to recognize. And then she says, we want to understand 9/11. If we want to understand Al-Qaeda, you'd go back to the waymark before. If this is 9/11, and this is her board work, I'll scroll down there in just a minute. If this is 9/11 and Al-Qaeda just attacked the United States here, you'd go back to 1996, which we know internally in the movement was formalization where the Time of the End magazine had come out. She says, if this is 9/11 and Al-Qaeda just attacked the United States, you go back to 1996 when Al-Qaeda declared war on the United States. So this was Al-Qaeda in here in 1996 when it was Osama bin Laden declared war on the United States. I believe he did it twice. So what we can't do is disconnect it within our reform line and try to understand this waymark disconnected from its previous history, which is why I encourage people to watch Tahiti. She's referring now to Elder Parminder's May 2019 studies, and in particular, the whole 10, all of them, but in particular number 4, which is actually titled, kind of had an epiphany this morning as I've been looking at all this, which is actually titled Islam and the Midnight Cry. And to me, that makes a point later that we'll get to. So, which is why I encourage people to watch Tahiti. The principal, one of his subjects is, if this is 1840, if you have 1840, we know that 1840 on our line lines up with 9/11, but she was making a point here that if this is 1840, we can't disconnect it from 1798. 1798, you have conflict in the Middle East. 1840 is directly related to 1798. And we can't cut 1840 off and understand it in a vacuum. So that was number 15, around the 41-minute mark of the May-June 2019 Portugal studies. So you can't take and disconnect 1840 from 1798. And we know that on our line, or on the big line, 1840 is placed at 9/11, and that was the restraint on the Ottoman Empire, or the East Wind, and the end of the Second Woe. And it's directly related to what happened in 1798. We've been working on some of the reviews, because when Elder Parminder first started those studies on Uriah Smith was right, I went back, started going back in and looking at those histories in 1798, which we're not going to go into here today. But where he was saying that Uriah Smith was right, I wanted to understand the Egyptian expedition that where Napoleon went to France. I'm sorry, Napoleon went to Egypt, was defeated by the King of the South, Egypt, goes to Turkey, was defeated by the King of the North, Turkey, and so he is the hymn of Daniel 11:40. That was the application, or I don't think it was an application, it was a literal history of what went on. And so there was, and it was directly related to this here that eventually led to a 10-year Syrian proxy war in the Millerite history from 1831 to 1841. And in those studies, he goes into that more in depth. So what happened here was directly related to this 10-year Syrian war. And towards the end of this Syrian war, it is a war between Egypt and Turkey. Towards the end of this, you have the end of the second woe, or the restraint of the Ottoman Empire. And he lined that up with our current history, which we'll look at a little bit more as we go forward. This 10-year Syrian proxy war, and we'll see the evidence of that. And when he did these studies, this was 2019 when he did these studies, already the movement was saying that 2021 would be the end of this war. It would be a 10-year proxy war, and it's broken down just as this is, where there's two years here of the battling. There's a break in between, and then the 2 years here. So I can't say necessarily there's a break here, but these offer significant events that need to be looked into, as well as in here. And I do have on the board, we'll focus a little bit on that later. So go ahead.
Elaine,
Yeah, go ahead.
before you move forward, I just have a quick clarification. So you said that in 1996, Osama bin Laden, did you say warned the United States twice? And was
Declared
that
war.
the fatwas that we have gone over in the past?
Say that again. Was it the what?
The fatwa, is that how you say it?
Yeah, yeah. FATWA. I think fatwa. Yes.
AH or something like that. Yeah.
Yes, it was.
So twice in 96?
I
He
think
warned?
it was 96 and 98.
Okay.
Yeah.
And both were fatwas?
Yes.
Explaining why?
From my memory, they were. You'd have to look them up, but from my memory, yes, they were declarations
Okay.
of war in the United States. And later, for those that have been with us on any of the studies on the West Coast, later it was after 9/11 where he wrote the letter to America, and he does explain a lot in there as well. Is his grievances with the West involved with the support of Israel? And there's a lot more to it, but that's a broad view.
And that to me is a huge point right there, what you just said, because you can see that collaboration with the United States and Israel now. So
Yes.
clearly, So
Yeah.
thank you, Elaine.
Mhm.
Hey, Elaine, before you
Yeah.
move on, could you please refresh my mind on the event that you are marking or tracing from 1798 with regards to Islam?
Here, right here,
Uh-huh.
1798.
What is the event that we are marking or we will be tracing?
The
From-
understanding of, and this I could refer back to the studies that Elder Parmenter did on Uriah Smith was right, where he goes into that history and shows the Daniel 11:40, Uriah Smith copied Josiah Litch. Josiah Litch is the one that uses the day equals a year in prophecy, which I have up here. I just kind of passed that part, which uses the day equals a year in prophecy that was the established methodology then used by William Miller. Josiah Litch uses it to determine the ending of the second woe, and which empowered the message. So it was the empowerment of the first angel. So there's a history here where Daniel 11:40, as literally laid out as historical, is that the king of the south went against him, and the him was Napoleon, and the king of the south was Egypt. This was his interpretation. And that the king of the north was Turkey, and the king of the north went against him, Napoleon. And it's in that history where you have two Ottoman, the king of the north and the king of the south were both Ottoman powers. Turkey was the, I don't know if I'm going to use the right phraseology. I can say that Egypt was a vassal. The Pasha of Egypt was a vassal of Turkey. So Turkey was the, I want to say leader. I don't know if that's the right way to say it. But what directly resulted from this, the king of the South, Egypt, defeating Napoleon. Napoleon turns his direction, and you have to go back to the history to understand why Napoleon went there. It takes a lot to go through those histories to why Napoleon went to Egypt. And I'll just give a brief of it, that England is at war with France, and that France wants to cut off England's economic supply in India, its relation with India. So he goes to Egypt to cut off the economic source that gives the economic strength to England. I always get them twisted up. So England. So anyways, that's why he's there. He meets resistance in Egypt and is defeated. He then turns to Turkey and he's defeated. And then he goes back to France. So that's a history where if you look into the Millerite history and the Adventist focus on the papacy, which brought us to that place where the focus was on the papacy rather than on the conflict in the Middle East. And we know that the history of the, see if I go back, where she says we cannot separate, where she says that we cannot separate 1840 from 1798 because it was a Middle Eastern conflict that was taking place. And when you come to 1979 to 1989, and the SDA Church here was meant to recognize that 10-year history and didn't, what would that have led them to see? If they had not rejected and been in Laodicean condition, been in darkness, if they had not rejected these teachings, and particularly even on the charts, which did not come into our view until after 9/11, the charts actually show the issue with the Ottoman Empire or the Middle East or the Angry Horse. So the SDA Church was in darkness and did not see that. So from 1989 to 9/11, you would have seen on the external the steps that led to the rise of the Angry Horse, leading
It's
to the
interesting.
attack.
So,
Sorry.
just a quick follow-up on that to conclude that. So in 1798, you're saying, if I'm understanding you correctly, so we have two powers. We have the Islamic power, and then you have the power that is coming to help, or we want to call them the Christian power. Those are the British, and well, the Napoleon is there in the middle. So we have that struggle, two struggles going on at the same time. Is that what you're saying? Is that how you're tracing it? Because I see the Islamic power here, which is divided, King of the North, the northern power, and the partial power, the Egypt, the partial of Egypt. So you have that struggle going on between those two. And then you have the Napoleon wanting to take advantage of that and rise up. And then we have the intervention of the British, the Christian powers, which ended up winning that struggle by the time you get to 1840. So thank you for the clarification.
Yeah, you're right in saying the Christian powers come involved later, if that's what you meant. Because at 1798, what you actually have is two Islamic powers and then the him making up. So the two Islamic powers make up the King of the North and the King of the South in him. And so when you go a little bit further, what led to that 10-year war was the Pasha of Egypt wants to actually become more independent. And there were a lot of wars in this history, 1798, leading up to 1840, where there were wars where, like the Greek War of Independence, there were different nations that were fighting for their independence from the Ottoman Empire. And Turkey asks Egypt to come help him with one of these battles, and promises him Syria, which is why we say Syria here, promises him Syria as a reward for his help in the battle. Egypt goes and accepts that and helps, but then Turkey does not give Syria to Egypt for that's what he promised him, and he did not give it to him, which led to this war here, this 10-year proxy war. If that makes a little bit more. Trying to keep it limited, I because there's so much to go through, but I'll give you the references of the presentations that will explain it all in detail, because we're kind of condensed into a very short time here to try to cover a whole lot of material. Is that okay for now, Mary?
Yeah, I'm okay with that. Thank you.
Okay. And I think somebody else.
Yeah, I just had a brief when you were explaining about the Adventist Church and that they were supposed to have recognized that history, right? When they didn't from 1979 to 1989, when they didn't recognize that history, they aligned themselves with the King of the North and not the true King of the North, which would be God, right? Because I can see their racism, their racist behavior even towards all Islamic people. And we're not to be racist towards all Islamic people. Because there was even a church next door to the Seventh-day Adventist church that I went to. There was a mosque, there was a mosque right next door. And the church wanted to build a huge wall between them to prevent those people. I mean, they were so afraid of those people. And it just jumped out at me how blind the church became to the truth God wanted to reveal when they aligned themselves against all Islamic people, because we know the people aren't all radicalized, if I'm making sense what I'm trying to say.
Well, you can see the same thing even in America right now.
Yeah,
That's
what I mean. They aligned themselves with that.
Yeah, we tend to have those that mimic that same radical position in different for different reasons or what have you, different motives, different beliefs, different ideology. So yeah, this was actually her comment that they were meant to recognize it because they didn't. They were in the Laodicean condition. They were in darkness. They did not remember their past in the way that they had led. They rejected that the King of the North was Turkey, which Uriah Smith stated in his book. That carried through to all of us. And so then in 1989, God raises up a messenger and a message of line upon line, specifically line upon line, which is going to be the repeating of history. So, but in the agricultural model, what dispensation, based on agriculture, what dispensation was 1989 to 9/11?
You mean plowing?
The plowing. So there's no way that this movement that's got your first angel arrive is ready to fully understand the repetition of that history. And as I said earlier, the charts don't even come into this movement until after 9/11. So we're unaware of that, and we have a lot of baggage that needs to be shed off of us before we can actually see that. But if you went back and looked at that history, you would see the markers of what the angry horse was doing. And even the external prophets were crying out as to what was coming. So this kind of goes along with another part of my this study on the east wind in particular is of the study of spheres of influence. For when we go back to the Midnight Cry message and the some of the major points, hard to say major, there were so many things that Elder Tess laid out for us and put in place. So this also was this is number 16 from 2019 Portugal, and very early on. How do these two superpowers fight in a Cold War? She talked about the Soviet Union and the United States. How do these two superpowers fight in a Cold War? You have a fight on two different levels. If we were to talk about the Cold War, you can see it's a 46-year history. And in this history, you have a war between two global superpowers, but they fight in a couple of different ways. From 1979 to 1989, they fight in Afghanistan, but that's a proxy war. When you come to a proxy war, you can have soldiers and guns and weapons. That didn't change the definition of this period of a Cold War, the 46-year period. It's not a Cold War between the United States and Afghanistan. Did I say that right? Yeah, it's not a Cold War between the United States and Afghanistan. That mode of warfare was on a different level. It's a Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. So you could say it's a hot war, 79 to 89, in Afghanistan. But what they don't do is attack each other in that fashion. So when you trace back, and these are some of the things that Elder Tess also put in place to the Cold War period, it's, I believe, 1933 or 38, prior to, where oil is discovered in Saudi Arabia. And in 1945, and I believe it was on the eve of FDR's death, he makes an agreement, comes into a pact, and I don't remember what ship, but they're on one of the American ships. And the king of Saudi Arabia comes to that ship and meets with FDR. They shake hands, make an agreement that that the United States would be security for the Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia would supply the oil. And that on his deathbed, he felt that it was so important to make that agreement before he died. So you have, at the end of World War II, entering into the Cold War, the United States coming into this pact, this agreement with, or league with Saudi Arabia. So in this Cold War, who would be the, how do I say, who would the king of the South want to then be trying to gather as within his sphere of influence? Would the battle be in sphere of influence? So during the Cold War, who is the king of the South? Where is the king of the South going to try to get his influence? Where's Saudi Arabia?
Middle East?
In the Middle East. So if they have Israel and Saudi Arabia and eventually others, what does the king of the South want to do? Where does the king of the South want to spread his influence?
Saudi
In the
Arabia?
Middle East.
In the Middle East.
In the Middle East. In the Middle East. So I see it on a bigger scale, or a bigger picture of three powers. I don't know if this is fully right. I'm open for discussions perhaps later so we can get through this. Three powers: the king of the North, the king of the South, and the East Wind, or the Middle East, or they're not. Anyways, I'll just leave it at that, the Middle East. And the king of the North wants to spread what to everybody?
Their Islamic religion.
Say that again.
I misspoke. Did you say King of the North or King?
Yeah,
of
the
South?
king of the North. What does the king of the North want to bring to everybody?
Democracy.
Democracy. What does the king of the South want to bring to everybody?
Communism.
Communism. And so the king of the South, this is just one piece of it. The king of the South, prior to 1979, is trying to go into Afghanistan to eventually set up and you have to read into that history to get more detail, a puppet communist supporting government, which brings I want to say war, brings civil war, conflict in Afghanistan, because you have strong Islamic beliefs that they want to defend and protect against communism. And eventually the Soviet Union has the confidence that they're strong enough, got a strong enough foothold that they enter in and assume that they're going to go in and out in 6 months and have it all done and dusted. And they wind up in this 10-year war that they're terribly losing. And it's in that period where you see the rise of the Middle East, the angry horse, coming up. And you have the Mujahideen fighters that are backed by the United States, Saudi Arabia, China is one. There are others. The main ones that Elder Tess pointed out was the United States and Saudi Arabia giving 8 billion. They matched what they gave to support the Mujahideen in this fight. So when you look at it as a proxy war, it's to prevent and to restrain the King of the South from being able to spread into, so that the United States or the King of the North would have its control over the Middle East. But at the same time, you have the Middle East that doesn't want either of them controlling them. This brings rise to a lot of the fundamentalist beliefs. So then I asked the question, and this I reviewed. I'm not really sure that she does say the point. I went back and reviewed it. Can't remember if she makes the point there, but we talked about this last night, that this was something that was taught by Elder Jeff, and I think still stands. And when you're looking at Isaiah chapter 8, there's a story in there that talks about, and it's not talking about the king of the south at the time, you're talking about Judah in Assyria, but it talks about coming up to the neck. What does it mean to come up to the neck? And I'll use the example of this ipsis as the second perspective as I remembered it. She gave this, the 2016 was the Battle of Ipsus, and she gave us a perspective of the two parties, Antigonus and Demetrius, fighting the three allies. And Demetrius is supported by Pyrrhus. I'm going to get them all straight. And they're fighting against the three allies. And she made the application of Antigonus being Clinton and Demetrius being Trump and Pyrrhus being Putin. And Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump are fighting for control of the three branches of government. But she gave a second perspective, because what we also learned in the Battle of Ipsus is that Ptolemy was not there. Seleucus had already been awarded Syria, Coal Syria, as his. And while the Battle of Ipsus is happening, Egypt, the king of the south, Ptolemy, goes up and takes Syria from Seleucus while Seleucus is busy elsewhere, before he has a chance to claim it. So Seleucus comes back after Ptolemy. They are actually friends, but yet, I don't want to say it wrong, but Seleucus wants what is his. So he goes and takes back what is his and goes all the way to Egypt, but doesn't enter into Egypt. In other words, when you go up to the neck, let me ask you, somebody if it wants to explain it, what do you see going up to the neck to mean?
I think it means you're taking the spheres of influence. You're not taking over your enemy's whole country. You're just taking the spheres of influence, the areas that are in contention.
Exactly. That's how I see it.
So when how we used to
talk about it also was to the neck meant up to like the capital, right? Because Moscow is what was preserved, what
Saying
remained after the fall.
meaning its government, is that what you mean? Meaning its government stays in place, so its king stays in place?
The king, yeah, the neck or the head seemed to be like the central governing power, like the capital is just what I remember at one time.
So you
You
take
preserve
this.
the mainland. You preserve the mainland. You're not taking the main country. You're not taking Russia, but you're taking the spheres of influence, all those countries that are the vassal states. Those
Yes.
countries are affiliated to.
So you take those satellite states, where the deadly wound and the death of the king of the south is, you take those satellite states, but you don't take Russia. Russia, the king and the kingdom are still in place, but they've lost their spheres of influence. So whether you look at it as the government or the king, the government, the rules based on the king and the kingdom, I guess you could make that distinction. But what we know in 1989 and then 1991 being the increase of knowledge is that they lost their spheres of influence, lost the satellite states. And this was stated, I believe, by, and I don't have the reference on this, sorry, this part, by, I know I've heard Elder Tess and Elder Parmenter both mention this, and you can find this in reading various articles and on Wikipedia as well, is that this 1989, the Soviet-Afghan war, the end of it was the primary cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was trying to gain, and had already had a warm water port, I believe, established in the Middle East. But that battle and that loss that was supported, where the Mujahideen fighters were supported by the United States and Saudi Arabia and others, China was one of them, is a win for the King of the North and a loss for the King of the South when it comes to proxy wars. The King of the South is pushed all the way back to the head. The head and the king and the kingdom are intact, but the satellite states are lost.
Did China support USSR or did it support
At that
US?
time, it was supporting the Mujahideen fighters.
Really? Wow.
I know, huh?
Thank you.
I haven't gone into the details of that myself, but yes, they were. They're on the list of doing that. So we went through a lot of that, and I'm going to go to a couple of places here. This was from the study by Elder Tess. This is the one that I'd been looking for a long time, and actually Christine found it, and I quoted from these quotes from the Portugal 2019. They're from this board work is from that study, because here's another thing that she laid in place. So we looked at what, if I'm doing this in an organized fashion, hopefully I am for everybody's sake. Well, I'm not that organized. We looked at Uriah Smith was right and saw the conflict in the Middle East. We see that Elder Tess endorses that conflict in the Middle East, that 1840 cannot be separated from 1798. Therefore, I take from that 9/11 can't be separated from 1989, and that the SDA Church was meant to recognize that 10-year history, to be able to see that in 1989 you're going to have history repeat, and you're going to have this conflict in the Middle East. The other thing that she put in place when she looked at 1798, and we see the deadly wound. Now, we looked at that. We have been looking at that deadly wound as being the papacy, and we know now it's a lot more clearly defined as the deadly wound that was received by the state. And so, but there was a deadly wound, and we knew the deadly wound would be healed, and that's Revelation 13, I think, yeah. So the deadly wound would be healed. So she brought that to 1989 and said that the King of the South, therefore, would receive a deadly wound and a death. but we knew that the deadly wound would be healed. So there's a resurrection. You have a death of the king of the south, a deadly wound and a death of the king of the south. Then you have a resurrection of the king of the south. She marks that resurrection at 2003 with Putin. And then she lined up because if there is a resurrection, and there was, of Russia no longer having its satellite states, but Russia is going to be resurrected, and now it's going to fight again for spheres of influence. And that would mean that Russia, the king of the south, we know when you go back to Elder Terry's studies with the three Romes, that there has to be a death to the king of the south. So repeating this history, she lined up 1989 as the deadly wound and 91 as the death, which we all are very familiar with that, with Panium 2021. And this is 2019 when she did this study. Panium would be the deadly wound of the king of the south, and Sunday law would mark the death. So I kind of struggled with some of these things for a while before I started openly saying it, because here's a major waymark, here's a minor waymark, and here's a major waymark. And in one sense, Panium, though it is pretty big, it's still the minor waymark, or the loud cry or midnight cry on the big line. So, but this is how she laid it out. And that's how I have it on the board behind me when we get there. I want to bring up a couple of things that before we go to the board. Going back to Afghanistan, let's see, I don't know if I want to go into all these details just yet. I want to go into Afghanistan. Well, no, I'll mention this right now, because this is something as well that Elder Tess brought in. Here you have the Soviet-Afghan War. It's a 10-year war, and it's followed by, and going back to here, there you have war, and it ends in a deadly wound. Panium, you have a 10-year war here, and it ends in a deadly wound for the King of the South, both histories. So both histories, the 10-year wars bring you to a deadly wound. One of the things she brought up was this name, Abdullah Yusuf Azam, which I'd forgotten about him. And he was a mentor to bin Laden, and you can trace him back. He is a Salafi jihadist. We know that there was civil war in Afghanistan, and the USSR is seeking spheres of influence in the Middle East. The USSR tried to push communism, some of these details I already just kind of mentioned, into Afghanistan. They want to set up a puppet pro-communist government. The fundamental Islamic extremists versus the USSR. And you also have the Shia Sunni Muslims are in concord against the USSR communism. And I highlight that because when Hamas attacked Israel, I believe it was probably the very same day, if not the next day, the first thing I wanted to find out is, do the Shias and the Sunnis ever unite? And what we do see in that battle is that the Shias and the Sunnis are united against Israel. So while they united as well against communism, when the Soviet Union left, they had their own civil war to deal with after that, because they did not, and even the extremists did not all agree. There were different levels of the extremism. Okay, so Abdullah Yusuf Azam, Elder Tess pointed out that he was a mentor to bin Laden. He dies in November of 1989, which is right after, it's November 24th, so this is the same month of the collapse of the Berlin Wall. He's a Jordanian Islamist, jihadist, and theologian belonging to the Salafi movement within Sunni Islam. In 1979, Azam issued a fatwa advocating for defensive jihad in light of the outbreak of the Soviet-Afghan War and subsequently moved to Pakistan to support the Afghan Mujahideen. So I wanted to know what defensive jihad means. Defensive jihad in the context of Islam refers to the duty of Muslims to defend themselves and their faith when faced with aggression. It's a struggle often involving military action, but also including other forms of resistance to repel an attack against the religion, the Muslim community, or its territory. The key principle is that it's a response to an existing threat, not an offensive action to expand territory or impose faith. It's not about initiating violence, but about defending against it. So that's what he believed and was advocating for, was defensive jihad. This here, I can pull it up a little bit here. I'm trying to remember. I don't think this was my book. I think it's one that's coming, a book on 1989, and I can share the title later. In the early summer of 1989, as Afghanistan started collapsing into civil war, bin Laden and al-Zawahiri, who was, by the way, the successor of bin Laden, convened a meeting that formalized the establishment of the elite fighting force destined eventually to use terror to achieve its aims. The new recruits, who signed an oath of fealty to bin Laden, eventually became known as Al-Qaeda, or the base, after the camp where they trained. Azam was appalled, according to his Algerian confidant and later son-in-law Abdullah Anas. He was against the method of trying to recruit people not for jihad in Afghanistan, but for planning to do something else. And al-Zawahiri retaliated by calling Azam a CIA spy. So as a teacher and mentor to Saudi militant Osama bin Laden, he was one of the key figures who persuaded bin Laden to go to Afghanistan and personally oversee the Mujahideen's efforts in the country. In 1984, Osama bin Laden co-founded Maktab al-Khidmat, an Islamic advocacy organization, and sought to raise funds for the Mujahideen while also recruiting non-Afghan fighters known as Afghan Arabs for the cause. Following the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1989, he continued to promote jihadist militancy on behalf of other Muslims in other countries, in an effort that led him to becoming known as the father of global jihad in many circles. And that was one of the points I believe that Elder Tess brought out, that he was called the father of jihad, of global jihad. But then note, when he dies on November 24th, 1989, Azam was killed in a car bomb detonated by unknown assailants in Pakistan. So his idea of global jihad is not to impose their faith on others and not about initiating violence, but to defend against it. And what we see Al-Qaeda forming and wanting to do is to recruit and bring those that want to do terrorist activities and go on the offense and attack and impose on others. So they were in a disagreement with their, would you say, beliefs or their ideology or their idea of global jihad. They were in disagreement. So this was one of the things that his son-in-law says: hijacking airplanes, explosions in a public place, that is not what Abdullah Azam called a jihad. So he dies in 1989. What would be the significance of his death in 1989? 1989 is a big way mark. What would that mean?
You mean time of the end?
Well, we know it's at time of the end. Big way mark.
Would it be the rise?
What are the implications of his death?
The
But
rise.
Osama bin Laden would.
Same thing like 1798 you mentioned, that has an effect to 1840. So that had an effect to 9/11, right?
Yes, that had an effect. Somebody else was saying something. Linda?
The rise?
I'll let
Can you-
Susan go.
I'm sorry. I didn't think maybe I was heard or could be heard. You can?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I'm sorry, Linda. Um, to me, from what you were explaining, the ideologies conflicting, right? One was about defense and one was about offense. So if he dies, the one that believes in um, defense rather than offense, it would mean to me the death of that ideology and the rise of the offensive or violent type of ideology.
And Linda?
Which I was gonna say maybe that would lead to Osama bin Laden taking a bigger role.
It paves the way.
Hmm.
So if there was going to be any restraint within the Middle East itself, that restraint was removed.
Yeah, and then after Osama bin Laden got killed, I remember this because um, circumstances, but after he was killed, his son, they began to worry about his son, and then I think they killed his son. So, anyway, that's just a side note.
Thank you. So this is just a little clarification or to verify when it comes to the Sunni Shia. While Sunni and Shia Muslims in Afghanistan initially united against the Soviet occupation, tensions and sectarian conflict emerged later. This becomes important, which we're not going to be able to get into today, in the rise of ISIS and what they represent. So tensions and sectarian conflict emerged later, primarily during the post-Soviet era. Initially, both groups fought under the umbrella of the Afghan Mujahideen against the Soviet Union. However, after the war, the Sunni-Shia divide intensified, particularly with Iran's support for the Shia movement and the rise of extremist groups. Since we're limited on time, I'm going to jump to, if you keep in mind the thing that Elder Tess said about we put too much focus on Al-Qaeda and ISIS, where prophecy and history tends to look towards countries. And there is a country that, I don't know if the word is allowed for, made the space for Al-Qaeda and ISIS, I guess we could put it that way. And so we're going to go down here. Go ahead.
So Elaine, can you see the pattern here that after the 1979 to 1989 war, you have the rise of Al-Qaeda with the help of US, and the Arab Spring War from 2011 to 2021, or in between you have the rise of ISIS, right? The Syrian war. But Arab Spring, what was that caused by? Going back there.
Arab Spring initially was pro-democracy, which is what the United States tries to bring, I think it began in Tunisia, where some pro-democracy protests were beginning to rise up, and they wanted to squash that. Eventually, then you have the situation in Syria where some young boys are writing graffiti, pro-democracy graffiti, and they get arrested and badly beaten. That kicks off the 10-year Syrian war.
So again, that was helped by the US? Did they fund it in a way for those protests to go on?
I don't know if they were funding that specifically. I don't know on that specific instance, but they're definitely trying to promote democracy. And that promotion of democracy, people like their freedom and they want their rights. So they start to stand up eventually and fight for their rights. So while they're fighting for their rights, you then have Syria taken, arrest and badly beat some young boys, and that was the initiation of it. That, as I see it, there's probably more details to look at that. And just to confirm, these are those that supported. Pakistan was the schools were put in place for the training of funding and training of the Mujahideen. You have the CIA, with Operation Cyclone, they would be also funding military aid, weapons to the Mujahideen. Saudi Arabia, financial and military support, matching the funding of the U.S. funding. And here's the other countries that are listed in this. So China and the United Kingdom, and other Muslim nations also contributed to the Mujahideen's efforts. Anyways, it's a big, it's a lot that we're supporting him. This name here, I don't know if we'll get to him, but we'll put a little bit of emphasis on him. He is in the history leading up to 9/11, he was the Northern Alliance leader and was very skillful in war. And he was assassinated on September 9 of 1989, which they say Osama bin Laden had to do with that. Not saying he did it, but had to do with orchestrating that, because that took this resistance of the Taliban. Am I saying this right? The resistance of the Taliban to where Al Qaeda could then do what they did. So there's a connection, a strong connection that needs to be understood between Afghanistan and the Taliban, and then the Taliban and Al Qaeda. And because the Taliban is the government of Afghanistan that allowed for and facilitated the rise of Al Qaeda and to be in Afghanistan. So when Elder Tess makes the point that we need to look at countries, who is it that was providing the space and the means for Al Qaeda to exist and to grow and to train? And it all points to Afghanistan. So before I want to cover one more detail before we go to the board. And this was, thank you, Kathy, for sending me this one. The meaning of Afghanistan. We're going to go through a couple of different things here on Afghanistan. This is an AI overview. The name Afghanistan means land of the Afghans or land of the Pashtuns. In a historical sense, the word Afghan itself is believed to be derived from Sanskrit and historically referred to the Pashtun people. And I believe the Pashtun people are about over 40% of the population of Afghanistan, which becomes significant to the ability to manipulate the people and to get the Taliban in place. So the Persian suffix stan, Afghanistan, stan, translates to place of. So it's the place of the Pashtuns. Afghan or Afghan, I don't know how to say that one, but Afghan, this term historically used to refer to Pashtun people, is believed to have roots in Sanskrit, potentially meaning horsemen or cavalrymen. Or you could put that together and say the place of the horsemen. Where do we know the horsemen to be? The horses.
The East Wind, the children of the East.
Yes. So then stan, again, this Persian suffix meaning place of is used in the name Afghanistan to indicate the land of the Afghans or the land of the horsemen. Is how I take that. The Sanskrit term as vaka, meaning horseman or cavalryman, is believed by some scholars to be connected to the modern Pashtun people, and the name Afghan, the name as vaka, is thought to be preserved in the word Pashtun, and the term Afghan is considered to be derived from Azvaka. The word Afghan is also believed to be derived from the Sanskrit word meaning killing, striking, or defending. I hadn't thought about that before, but what does a scorpion do? Don't they strike? I don't know. I think that's what they do. So I thought it was interesting to add to this that when Elder Tess places tells us that history and prophecy tend to focus on countries, that it's the country that actually I don't know how to say it. Maybe somebody has a better way to phrase it, but allowed for Al Qaeda to grow and fester in Afghanistan, which we can see is the place of the horsemen. And the other thing about Afghanistan, and this came to me a long time ago in when 2021, when the troops were pulled out of Afghanistan, completing the treaty that the promise that or treaty that Trump said that the Trump troops would be pulled out. If you look into that history prior to that happening, the Taliban had control of much of Afghanistan before that ever even happened. And so when they collapsed, they say that, well, they knew that it would probably happen, but they didn't expect it to happen so fast. I don't know how I am not a scholar in any way, but with what I have read and learned, they already had control of much of Afghanistan. And it was just a matter of the US troops leaving and taking back control. And so I'm trying to remember the point that I tried to make for that. Oh, because it shows that, like in the Millerite history, you can trace the conflict in the Middle East. If you can see this, I hope you can see it okay. You can trace the history. You can trace through the history of the Millerite history, the Middle East conflict. If you see that. So there's Middle East conflict that can be traced all the way through the history, or Angry Horse. This up here goes through the study of the 10-year Syrian war between Egypt and Turkey, and how Elder Parmenter actually said that it's no coincidence that you have this 10-year Syrian war. This was in 2019 when he started to teach this. And then you have 2021 marks the end with the troop withdrawal. And what happens? The Taliban rises back to power and takes over. Okay, so this is where I took from what all of those pieces, and probably a few more that I'm forgetting at this time, and took her 10-year war, Soviet-Afghan war, leads to the deadly wound, 1989, and the 10-year Syrian war that leads to the deadly wound in 2021. I still have questions in here because we know from another story, because we know that this movement is made up, the message comes from many stories all being laid on top of one another, but you shouldn't be mixing stories. That Biden also, marked at 2021, starts to use the King of the South's method of war, information war, against Russia over the Ukraine issue, which is a separate story. So maybe there's still something here that could mark this better than what I have yet, as the deadly wound against the King of the South and his sphere of influence in the Middle East. So when you trace through this history, this is where Gorbachev is put in place. Osama bin Laden is placed at being on the ground in Afghanistan in 1984. Not that he may not have been there sooner, but that's when he's first marked. You have the Mujahideen that are backed by the US, China, Britain, as well as Saudi Arabia. You have bin Laden here. And then I think I've seen different writings, so I don't know quite if it's 88 or 89, but Al-Qaeda, from what, and I think Elder Tess marked it at 1988, Al-Qaeda is formed. And at that time, when Al-Qaeda is formed, this is on the verge of the end of the Soviet-Afghan war, that the Al-Qaeda is already turning its focus to the King of the North. So you have, after this 10-year period, the deadly wound for the king of the south. He's going to lose his spheres of influence. You have the Middle East, or the angry horse, already putting his eyes on the United States. And keep in mind, the United States is a major contributor to what made possible this. Weapons training, military funding actually makes way for this to then go turn and want to use it on the United States. So if the SDA church had recognized, if they were not in the Laodicean condition, if they remembered their past history, if they didn't reject the charts, if they didn't reject the teaching of the interpretation of the king of the north and the king of the south being Turkey and Egypt, then when line upon line opened up, they'd be ready to see this repetition of history of this conflict in the Middle East that is going to culminate in what we now know to be the first part of the third woe. So when you add into this the triple application of prophecy, the first woe, hurt, plus the second woe, kill, equals the third woe. So the third woe would come in two parts. So this history would culminate in what we would mark as the beginning of the investigative judgment, or the third woe, and the hurt. Elder Tess marked this history as a cause and effect when she did that cause and effect study. I have those written down here. When she did the cause and effect study, when she took a waymark and said we need to better understand a waymark, and said that there are many prophetic events that take place in a waymark, usually within a 1-year period, but there's one event that marks time. And for this one, the time that we were given by the event was at 9/11. It's not a restraint. It's when they attack, because you have them building here. And I skipped over here because in 1996, you have the formation of the Taliban. There's a lot of history that takes you from Al-Qaeda, the Mujahideen, to Al-Qaeda, to the Taliban. Now the Taliban are the ruling government that is allowing Al-Qaeda to fester and grow and train and plan this strike here. In 1996, I have some things mixed up here, sorry, but I don't have it. Yeah, 1996, that's right. So in 1996, bin Laden declares war on the United States. And I believe he did it again in 1998. And then in 1998, you have the two bombings, U.S. embassy bombings they were both in Africa. One was Kenya. I can't remember the other one, but this is on August 7th of 1998, simultaneous attacks. You have external prophets that are predicting all of this, that are predicting that they're going to do something, not a date, but they already see bin Laden back here, and they are beginning to understand, but they fail to recognize this. The SDA church fails to recognize this. God raises up a messenger with the study of line upon line, or history is going to repeat, which we are not going to yet understand, because this is also put in place by Elder Parmenter as a harbinger that points to what? What does the harbinger point to?
The close of probation.
The close of probation.
Yeah.
So you would see the hurt, and then you would see the kill, or the executive judgment. So when you come down here, there are a lot of things that you can put in here, a lot more that can be put in here. I'm going to highlight a few. The Arab Spring kicks off in 2001. You got now this 10-year Syrian civil war. ISIS is formed in 2013. And this is, it gets really complicated because you have to go I think it was Mary or somebody that mentioned before this history, because you're now going to have this situation that's going to rise to become ISIS, which comes from Al-Qaeda, but they have different goals Al-Qaeda's goal is global jihad. ISIS's goal is this sectarian conflict that is more regionally located. And so you have the history back here of the United States goes into Afghanistan. November 9, they're restrained. And that goes to that, we'll bring that later. So the east wind is now restrained. Afghanistan, the restraint is placed on Afghanistan, on the Taliban government. But you also have, when that happens, around 2003, I think it is, where the United States starts to turn its focus from Afghanistan to Iraq, the war in Iraq. And it's in that period of time where the Taliban starts to take a foothold again and build back up. And then you wind up with this 20-year war in Afghanistan that culminates in this departure of the US troops. So ISIS, it's Baghdadi, I believe, al-Baghdadi, who wants to have the, when I say prestige, I don't know how to word it right. He wants to have the backing and support and the prestige that comes that would help him with his goals, the prestige that comes from being connected to Al-Qaeda. But he has different goals. So he kind of wrestles with not bending the knee or bowing to bin Laden. And eventually he does. And so then you wind up with Al-Qaeda in Iraq is what it's called, Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And that eventually, in the Syrian civil war, he breaks away from Al-Qaeda and to do this sectarian war, and that's where you see the rise of ISIS. ISIS is Islamic State, and then, or IS is Islamic State, and this just identifies it as Iraq and Syria, or ISIL, Iraq in Syria and the Levant, or ISIS-K, which is Islamic State of Khorasan, and the different affiliations of where they at. So they have affiliations in many places, including Europe, and including likely here as well, where we are at. So in 2015, so the caliphate is declared, Baghdadi declares himself a caliphate of ISIS, not global, but regional. And this is where Putin comes in, because he's going to support, he wants to have his Middle East spheres of influence, and he's supporting and helping to prop up Syria and Assad. So you get him raising up into prestige here. Trump is put in place in 2017. He's elected in 2016. 2017, he's inaugurated. You come to 2019, February of 2019, al-Baghdadi is killed. Trump declares ISIS is defeated. And then he makes this peace treaty with the Taliban, which is, when you really understand what the Taliban and being the government of Afghanistan and what they allowed culminated in this. And he's making a peace treaty with them. And some good videos to watch, if a lot of us watch Frontline. They do a series called America and the Taliban, and it's 3 videos that are worth watching. There's one called The Rise of ISIS, worth watching. And then there's one called, somebody else can correct me on this one because I think I said it wrong, but American Terrorist. There's a different title to it, I think, than American Terrorist. If you could put it in the chat, that would be great, because those of us on the West Coast would know what that is, and some of you watched it. So Trump makes this peace treaty, but the Taliban then kills a U.S. Marine. So he backs out of the peace treaty, but then he reestablishes that peace treaty. And then just before Biden is put into office, he makes the commitment with that peace treaty that the U.S. will withdraw all their troops. And keep in mind, we've already stated that at this point in time, the Taliban already has control, and is documented, they have control of a good portion of Afghanistan already. So when Biden pulls the troops out, that's where we see everything just break loose. The Taliban is now rising again. So if the Taliban is now rising, I have a few things that I don't have perfectly put in place, because you see the Taliban rising here, but in this history, it's from the death. And in this history, it's a deadly wound. So I'm still struggling with a few pieces of this myself. But you have the rise of the Taliban. They're in Afghanistan. That's going to culminate eventually in the executive judgment or kill. So if this was the harbinger, this is what I mean by holding on to the pieces of information that were given to us in our current history of this movement. So I guess you would say our past history, but within this movement by the messengers. So the harbinger is put in place as the close of probation based on volume 9 of the testimonies, that when I can't remember I don't have that one in my mind, which presentation it was where he was a few where he goes through that. And in Portugal, he goes and revisits that as well. So you can find it in the Portugal 2020 schools that went on. That in reading those passages carefully, that it is when there is no more forbearance, there's no more saving, that's when the killing happens. So the second part of the third woe would be fulfilled. And I know that this leaves me anyways with still questions now that we're understanding this dispensation to the second advent, that this being Daniel 12:1, leading to the second advent, that people are that this is actually a period of time here as well. So if this history, let me see if I put this question right. This history here led to the start of the third woe, then this deadly wound, death, this history here leads to Daniel 12:1. What I will kind of conclude with how I see that is what the SDA Church did not see and understand due to their Laodicean condition in darkness. This history gets line upon line and develops this message through, so that the harbinger, that we look back and see the harbinger, we should now be able to take and trace this history. Because if anybody remembers, I think it was last week when Aaron taught with us, and it brought up a lot of thoughts to my mind to this, that if this is the waymark, the dispensation between 1989 and 2001, this is the waymark. It's a created waymark by the movement that points to the east wind, the harbinger, the beginning of the third woe, the beginning of the investigative judgment. So this message would have been the message of the angry horse. So if this is the message, what is the unsealing, increase of knowledge, and formalization about? I'll put that question out there for anybody. Did you follow the question?
Yes, but if you could ask it again, please.
If this is the waymark, the east wind, then when we follow Boston, Concord, and Exeter, Boston is an unsealing, Concord is an increase of knowledge, Exeter is a formalization, and that then you have this as the waymark. So if the east wind or the angry horse is the waymark, what should the Boston, Concord, and Exeter be showing us? Angry horse.
Right. So the steps leading up to the the test.
They should be pointing, this information should be pointing to that. So if if that's the waymark and that's what the information externally was pointing to, and if Adventism had remembered their history and not rejected it, they would have traced this and seen it, but they didn't. We didn't, because we're in a plowing. The movement is in this plowing and darkness. But now we have this history to look back on. And so now we aren't blind. So if this is Daniel 12:1, what is the message of Daniel 12:1? If we're repeating this, that's how I see it. That we are repeating the period from the deadly wound to the executive judgment. But you would move it. This is where I get a little stuck on some of the stuff, and maybe somebody else can take up and figure what I still can't figure out, is that this dispensation should be based on what's going to happen here. Is that right?
I think I'm kind of having a hard time following, just because I think I was having a hard time seeing the board. So I was seeing the National Sunday Law being 2021, but that's not what you were talking about.
No, it's not. Yeah, it's 2024. I'll leave that for those that don't want to see that.
So I guess because you were pointing to that and calling that the deadly wound. And that was another reason I was getting confused, because the deadly wound was at 2021. And
it's still a challenge for me to take the 10-year war ends at the deadly wound. The 10-year war ends at the deadly wound. But the death is a little waymark, and the death is a big waymark. And this deadly wound is a little waymark on the big line, right? And then
I can't see when you're circling. This is the deadly wound. What is that's the 2021.
Yeah, the deadly wound at 2021 is a little waymark on the big line. It is a little waymark. Okay, but the deadly wound at 1989 is a big waymark.
Big waymark.
So that's where I'm kind of confused, because they're crossed. If that makes sense.
2020, so 2021. In 2021, the one that you have it there, the deadly wound. So who's dying? Who's getting the wound there? And who is killing who is inflicting the wound?
Who did Elder Tess teach that gets the deadly wound? When you look at the three lines
in 2021,
Russia,
the king of the south. And I don't have in place, at least on the line of looking at the conflict in the Middle East, because it would have to be something leading up to the king of the south beginning to lose his spheres of influence. Maybe it's connected to the Ukraine thing, because it's the Ukraine issue that drains him, to where when you get to October of 2024 and the collapse of Syria, he's unable to help his allies in the Middle East.
So that you've been tracing the line of the activities of the East Wind Islam there.
Yes.
So in 2021 there, what is the East Wind doing?
What is who doing?
The East Wind.
The East Wind?
Yeah.
I think that's what I'm saying. I still haven't quite put in place too, because it's the king of the south that's going to receive a deadly wound. According to Elder Tess's studies, the issue is over spheres of influence in the Middle East. Here, it's spheres of influence spheres of influence where in 79 to 89, the Soviet Union is going to receive the deadly wound. And in here, it's Russia that receives the deadly wound. The issue is still a Middle Eastern conflict. The issue here is a Middle Eastern conflict. So the deadly wound, I believe, has to be more associated with the Middle Eastern conflict rather than Biden's information war that he's using against the king of the south when it comes to Ukraine. I still have questions. to fill.
Okay, and didn't we have what's his name? Assad uh doing something around that time there.
In
Syria.
2021?
Yeah, around that time, yeah. Don't they place Syria conflict there and Russia Russians influence there, sort of? Is that what I think that's what some of the teachers teach?
Yeah, I don't have this one figured out.
Okay.
We know it's the end of the Syrian war, and there's something here in this here. We see that Putin in 2015 gains a lot of strength here in his foothold in the Middle East. So there's something here that starts to strike at his foothold in the Middle East that culminates in the October 2024, where Assad and the Syrian government Syria collapses. The death. So I'm just putting on record, I guess, myself, that when it comes to the death, I said it last night, when it comes to the death of the King of the South, I personally believe that it's based on the sphere of influence here in the Middle East, not Ukraine. I see Ukraine as a separate issue. That's how I see it, and I'm open for correction. But because what he really lost here in October of 2024 was his ability, based on the Ukraine conflict, he has lost his ability to be able to support his allies in the Middle East, or he has no sphere of influence left in the Middle East.
That's interesting. And one thing that did happen in 2021 with Syria, that was the end of the 10-year, like the Arab Spring.
Yes.
That rose up in 2011.
Yes.
2021 marked the end of the 10 years of that.
Yes.
So, Elaine,
I know we went over time. I apologize if everybody's okay, or we can go ahead, Troy. Just want to put that out there.
I'm happy you mentioned that point again. So it could be that Ukraine is really a separate issue. Could be. And that could be affiliated with the external events, the worldwide Sunday law. I'm seeing that just came to mind, so I just threw it out there.
And I know when you go back to the phrase "take it up to the neck," it pushed him out of the Middle East, or it shows that he's no longer has influence in the Middle East, and he's just Russia alone again to continue through this history with his battle in Ukraine and all that entails. I'm not on that. My mind isn't in there like some of the others are focused on. I've been focused on the Middle East.
That's consistent.
I think
sorry,
let
everybody.
me ask if Kathy was going to say something.
Oh, I was just gonna make a observation that when you look at 1989, and then the deadly wound for USSR, Ukraine was a sphere of influence at that time period.
Yes.
So Putin never had Ukraine as a sphere of influence since they separated from the USSR, right? Whereas the Middle East were spheres of influence. Now, Putin, I think, is trying to get back those original spheres of influence that the USSR had. So I'm kind of seeing Ukraine, like you said, as a separate issue, whereas the other ones are clearly proxies.
I see it as connected to the four winds that are let loose. The angry horse is seeking to break loose, and you have the four winds that are talked about. I don't have that fully understood, but she uses the phrase the four winds, meaning from the four corners. So you have the king of the north, the king of the south, which would be Russia. You have the east wind, and then you have what would be called the west, which is often referred to the European nation, was the West, or NATO.
The worldwide then.
For the worldwide event.
Yeah, it sounds consistent to me.
Well, anybody
I have a
wants
question
to,
about the going back to the 1831 to 1841, the war between Egypt and Turkey.
Mhm.
Were there other countries involved there, or is it just Egypt and versus Turkey over? They're fighting over. Were they fighting over Syria? Is that right?
They're fighting over Syria. Yes.
Uh-huh.
And there
So
were
there
other
wasn't.
things.
Uh-huh.
Go
Yeah,
ahead.
go ahead. Yeah, was France involved there?
At that point, I think you'd have to go back to Josiah Litch's writings on to determine who all's there when it comes to that would be around, I think it was you, somebody, or maybe Mary talked about the Christian powers that were
Yes, and that
that
is
were involved.
the beginning. That's the beginning of the time of the end. We have those four powers coming into conflict. You have the Christian powers, you have the Islam powers, then you have Napoleon. And we have the British, they could not allow Napoleon to take over Egypt because Egypt was in between British and India. British was concerned about India, the breadbasket. And Napoleon wanted to block British there in Egypt. So Napoleon's plan was to take Egypt and then go take Syria and take Turkey and then rule. So we have all these wars. It's all about the breadbasket and how they're gonna block each other. And we see the same dynamic happening in 1989 and the conclusion of that at the you wanna call it close of probation.
Yeah,
So
because
the
you can
spheres
look
of influence, the spheres of influence with regards to Russia, we can see Russia wanting to control Syria, the southern part, and also the western part, that being the Ukraine and all of that region. So we can see all those two conflicts taking place.
yeah, in this history, here's the reference to go to if you haven't already. Probably most of us have already looked into this because this came out like in 2019. This was being opened up in 2019, but it's 1841, Josiah Litch, and it's an appeal to the I can't remember what the E is, but to the clergy and to the public, I think. An appeal to the public and the clergy, something like that. And this was the reference there, 98.1, to get to this place where he lays out that history. And so that's helpful to go back and look at. In this history as well, I think 1812 to 1818 was a Wahhabi Ottoman war. The Ottomans actually saw the Wahhabis, because the Ottoman here in that war would represent, it was Egypt and the Wahhabis, or the Wahhabi Ottoman War. So the Ottoman Empire actually saw the Wahhabis as too extreme and as a threat. And that's in my notes here somewhere too, but as a threat. So you have that war taking place. You have the Greek War of Independence that started around 1831, I think, and went for several years. So you see what is happening is going from the first and second woes, or this fifth and sixth trumpet, where you see the Revelation 9 and Mohammedism in 606 being let loose, and that goes back to the war between Rome and Persia that went on for a long time, and the Persian king rejects Muhammad's offer to come and help. That actually makes way for Persia to be destroyed, conquered by Rome, and that removes them out of the way. That allows the smoke from the bottomless pit to rise up to eventually take Constantinople. So the Ottoman Empire grows, grows, and grows and grows. And then we're seeing in this history where it begins to shrink. And so in here in particular, you're seeing some of these wars that are shrinking, people fighting for their nations fighting for their independence, that eventually culminates in here. The Ottoman Empire isn't completely done away with though until World War I. But we've definitely gone way over. So
Thank you.
Yeah, I hope that was helpful, but I will be going over it again at the camp meeting. So if anything, it helps to think about it, and when we go back to it, maybe some of the other presentations you can review between now and then that are really helpful to put some of these things in place. And I'm open to, there's areas I still have questions, and then there's definitely other studies that are teaching other things. So if they're right, then that's a discussion to be had as well. Okay, anybody else before we close? Thank you for,
This was excellent. Thank you so much, Elaine.
yeah, thank you for allowing me to, sorry I went over. Okay, so let's go ahead and close in prayer. Almighty God in heaven, Lord, we thank you for your continued mercy, your blessings that you bestow upon each one of us, and especially the guidance and direction that you give us in the way that you have led us in the past, that we would not stumble as we continue on in this dispensation. Help us each to weigh out the evidences of the things that have been put in place by your messengers, and that let those be tools as we are, I know myself, weak in methodology, but is it that the messages that have already been put in place can be a good measure to go by? Help us all to ponder these things and meditate upon these things, that each of the studies that are out there would help us all to work together, to have love for one another, compassion for one another, and to grow into perfect unity, that we might glorify you on earth. We thank you for the blessing of the Sabbath. We pray that you'd continue to be with us throughout the rest of the day and help us to think on these things as we go forth later and enter into the new week. We thank you and we praise you, and we ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Just